How's it going, everybody? Priscilla here from Commander's Cauldron, and I'm bringing you another deck tech for my Reyhan Kraum Black Cauldron deck. The last time I made a video for this, it felt like it was a little rushed and probably not my best work. It didn't really cover a lot of the deck itself, so I figured let's do it again. This one will be a little bit more in-depth. I'll kind of cover what's in the primer a little bit, but I also just want to talk about each card individually. There's a lot of cards in here that people might not understand or just don't really see their application in my version of the list specifically, and I want to cover that. I want to give everybody the tools they can to succeed with my deck, and also just include some caveats that I don't actually really mention a lot of places, and get into some of the theory behind the deck. So, starting off, we have our commanders. We have Reyhan, Last of the Abzan, and Kraum Ludovic's Opus. These two are a sans white pair, and the first question that I usually bring up, or that gets asked of me, is why Reyhan? Why are we playing her over Ikra? What is the benefit here? Are there actually 1/1 counter synergies in this deck? And the kind of short answer is yes. We are playing 1/1 counter synergies, and we have a lot of those involved in the deck. But also, Reyhan is actually an incredibly important part of this deck, and just how it kind of functions and pivots around during games. I think I cast Reyhan more than I cast Kraum. That's just kind of how important she is for this deck, and I'll get into that a little bit more when we get into some of the other card choices. But needless to say, Reyhan's super duper important. Her being 3 CMC is very, very important for how this deck works. And worst comes to worst, she is good sacrifice fodder and turns our Kraum into a 7/7, which in these kind of grindy, mid-game, really just mid-range focused, in these grindy, mid-range focused games, having a 7/7 flyer kind of can just get you there sometimes. It's a lot of pressure to put on people, and combat damage with this deck is a win con. It's like our C plan most of the time, and the games where it comes to that, it's because people make mistakes, getting punched by a giant Kraum over and over. So the first non-commander card I'm going to talk about is it's a pet card of mine. A lot of people know that this card was actually the commander that I played for most of my first year into CEDH, and it was sort of my whole identity for a little bit. And that's Mulligans and Matchups Timeless Heroes. A lot of people don't play Planeswalkers in their CEDH lists. I think I usually only end up seeing them. I usually end up seeing things like Teferi, which is the combo with Displacer Kitten. And otherwise, Planeswalkers aren't a super duper represented card type in CEDH. There's a lot of different reasons for why that is, don't get me wrong. But Minsc & Boo is a very, very strong card on its own, and is also just a very valuable draw engine in this deck. When it enters the battlefield, it makes a hamster, which right there, it creates a body to kind of protect itself, and it buffs that body up. But also notably, this can buff our Kraum. So again, in those games where we're in that mid-range grind and nobody can really go for it, getting to just continuously pump your Kraum up over and over, it's horrifying. Not many people can deal with a massive flying attacker like that. Additionally, the math on Mulligans Boo by itself is, on the first cast, you get a 4/4 haste trample attacker. Second turn that it's out, you get to draw 4 cards and remove a creature with the -2 ability. And then third turn that it's out, you get the 4/4 back. It's basically draw 4 cards every other turn, and that is the lowest, the floor of this card. And most of the time, it just being a 4 mana, draw 4, remove a creature, is usually good enough to keep it in here. This is a card that is kind of for my own personal taste, and I think that the other big brewer for this deck, Steven, I think that they are still on Mulligans & Boo as well, and it kind of exemplifies just how mid-range this deck really is. And I think that can kind of give you a little foresight into some of the other card choices that you might see already. So as you can see, we're on 22 creatures, which is pretty high compared to other Sans White lists. This kind of really also just explains how creature heavy our game plan is. Something that I really enjoy about this deck is how it doesn't feed into non-creature hate. So things like Mystic Remora and Esper Sentinel and even Dockside Extortionist. We are very heavy on creatures and pretty light on artifacts and enchantments. And that is just a giant boon for this deck. And when we get into the individual cards here, you'll also see that we actually kind of prey on the other decks that are similar to us. There's a lot of kind of hate creatures in here that specifically target creature-focused decks, because those are the ones that we have sort of the hardest time interacting with. So starting off with our creatures, we have our Elvish Spirit Guide and our Simian Spirit Guide. These are some quick mana acceleration that we kind of are primarily using because they don't feed into Mystic Remora, they don't feed into Rhystic Studies or Esper Sentinels, and them being creatures means that they are usable with a very important card of this deck, which is Survival of the Fittest. We will get into that. Next, just kind of continuing on the mana train, we have Birds of Paradise, Deathrite Shaman, Tinderwall, and I'm even going to include Bloom Tender here. All of these are our mana dorks that we're running. We aren't super heavy on mana dorks in this deck. It's kind of just the best of the best. As you can see, I'm not even on Ignoble Hierarch anymore because there were too many games where not having access to that fourth color was hindering me. Do I think Ignoble Hierarch is still good in this deck? Absolutely. I think if you need one more mana dork, it's either that or Delighted Halfling. And you know, right now this is just what's been working with me. I was actually the biggest Deathrite Shaman hater on the planet. I still kind of am, but having a mana dork that most of the time will tap for a mana of any color, especially in the early game when we are just kind of establishing our board state, it's been very, very useful. Having also just one more graveyard hate piece has been really important. It's something that our deck is very good at, is hating on other graveyard focused decks, and I think having that extra layer there is awesome. Another kind of cute synergy in this deck is with Tinderwall and Bloom Tender, and as you can maybe predict or could tell by the name of this deck, we are an Agatha's Soul Cauldron deck. Being able to turn any of our creatures into Tinderwalls for bursts of mana, or Bloom Tenders for just crazy amounts of mana production has been really, really cool. Specifically also getting to turn Reyhan into a Tinderwall to sack is almost like a Rite of Flame, and then put those counters onto Kraum or onto another creature, which we can then sack and turn into a Rite of Flame. It's one of those niche little interactions that doesn't always come up, but when it happens, it's cool as hell. So moving on from our mana dorks, we are going over to Dothy Voidwalker. Speaking of graveyard hate, this is like one of the top-notch primo graveyard hate pieces in the format. Just anytime anybody does anything in the graveyard, boom, put it in the void zone, and then we're going to have access to it later. Now, in a similar vein as Tinderwall and Bloom Tender, Dothy is incredibly good under Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Being able to turn multiple of our creatures into Dothys, at least just to get extra cards out of it, is crazy good value. It's also something that, funnily enough, comes up when your opponents have a Dothy, and being able to snipe a card out of the Dothy zone at instant speed, if it's like a counter spell or something that's in there that they weren't using, it's kind of crazy. And it's an unexpected line of play that people don't usually see coming. Next card here, we have Dockside Extortionist. I don't think I need to get into why Dockside is in this list or why it's good. You know, it is maybe the best ritual in the entirety of CEDH. It's just such a powerful card, being able to make you as many treasures as, you know, as greedy as your opponents are. And that is really the big highlight for Dockside in this deck. We don't feed Docksides very well, but we eat off of other people feeding Dockside. And those are the bursts of mana and the kind of intricacies of this list that take people by surprise a lot. It definitely throws people off when they're like, wow, why is my Dockside count 2? Dockside, incredibly good card. Also just a giant ritual that we need to sometimes help fuel Razaketh, or even cast some of our cards if we need to hard cast them, like Niv Mizzet, which we will also get into in a second. Next, we have a couple more 2-drops. The first one is going to be Gilded Drake. So this is normally the slot where you would probably think there's a Phantasmal Image or a Flesh Duplicate. Here's my hot take. You don't need to fill your deck with a billion clones. I think that the 2 CMC clones are good. Phantasmal Image and Flesh Duplicate, they are both very, very good cards. And I think in other decks, having access to those cards is really important. In this deck specifically, and with my play style, with how it is, I think Gilded Drake puts in a lot more work than any clone effect would. Yes, we don't get access to people's ETBs with Gilded Drake. We are just kind of straight up stealing stuff from them, and that's it. But the thing with Gilded Drake is we are taking from them. I would much rather completely steal a Tymna or a Kinnan or kind of just any value creature from my opponent, rather than them get to keep their value creature and I get one. It's this kind of balance of resource denial that I personally prefer to play. It's this giant tempo swing play that just really only can happen with Gilded Drake, and it wins me so many games just by outgrinding people, which is what our deck is meant to do. We are a mid-range deck, like through and through. We are mid-range with a Reanimator spin on it and denying resources from all of our opponents so they can't push through that grind, they can't get ahead of us at all, is really important. Ledger Shredder, this is our mini Kraum that also lets us dump cards into the graveyard when we need to. It's an important card to have when we might have Razaketh or Niv Mizzet in our hands and kind of dumping stuff in there. But it's also important for us to fill our graveyard because we're a Underworld Breach deck. We do need to have a certain amount of cards in our graveyard in order to use the Breach combo, and Ledger Shredder helps us get there. It also has this unique synergy where it gets 1/1 counters, which ties all the way back to Reyhan. So removing a Ledger Shredder kind of turns into, if we remove the Ledger Shredder, then Reyhan just puts the counters onto something else. Or if we remove Reyhan, then the Ledger Shredder just gets bigger, or vice versa, or any combination of those things. And Ledger Shredder is just a crazy good value card that helps us push through with a giant flyer sometimes, and it's just all about what this deck wants to do. Here is one of the first kind of boogeymen cards that we have in the deck. This is our Orcish Bowmasters, which is going to tie back in very shortly with a card right below it. This little Massacre Girl right here, who we will talk about in a lot of depth, because this is the first card, the big card that a lot of people don't usually understand or get yet. So we'll get back to that. Orcish Bowmasters, one of the biggest card draw hate pieces in the format right now. Pressuring boards, pressuring life totals, essentially telling most creature strategies, if you want to draw cards, you're not going to have creatures anymore. It kind of kills a lot of strategies out. It's an incredibly important card for this deck. Also, because tying it all back to Reyhan one more time, that army gets 1/1 counters on it when it amasses. So being able to have your Orc army be a Tinderwall, or a Bloom Tender, or any activated ability from your opponents. I've played games where somebody has a Ranger Captain in their graveyard, and I turn my Orc army into a Ranger Captain just to get the army back again. Thassa's Oracle. I don't know if I need to go super in depth about this card. This is the premier win con in CEDH. We have Thassa's Oracle with Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact as our kind of 2-card, 3 to 4 mana combo that just can win us the game outright. We're in Dimir colors, so we're going to be running this. So on to another kind of spicy pick. Here is Braid's Arisen Nightmare. Now, kind of leaning back into this creaturey draw engine focus that I mentioned and not feeding into Docksides and Ristics and everything, Braids is one of our answers for that. 3 mana, castable off a Dark Ritual, a 3/3 body, all great. So Braids is one of those cards that sounds kind of weird on paper. You know, you're sacrificing part of your own board state and hoping your opponents make the choice that gives you a card. And, you know, that is the thing I always hear about this card is you never want to give your opponent a choice. They're never going to choose to do what you want. And with that, I say, no matter what choice they make, it's what I want. If I'm going down on... But in my experience so far with this card, every time I have used it, this reads, draw 3 cards in your end step. And that's pretty crazy. I think that's a pretty good effect. Our next 3-drop here is Eternal Witness. This is something that doesn't usually make the cut in a lot of these kind of decks. Being a 4-color list, it can be really, really tight, and having Eternal Witness is sort of a luxury card, I think, for most decks. For me, I value being able to fix my mistakes a lot. If I screw up, or if I screw up an Underworld Breach and I'm just like, dang, that's just gone now. I want a way to get it back. And I don't mind investing the extra mana in getting it back while also developing a body that I wouldn't get from something like Noxious Revival. Another card that most other Reyhan Kraum lists aren't going to be on is Mayhem Devil. This is kind of tying into a similar area that Orcish Bowmasters ties into, where it punishes a specific type of card or a specific play pattern from our opponents. Mayhem Devil basically turning a ping of damage anytime somebody sacrifices anything can be really good. It completely hoses all Dockside loop strategies, basically. It's just a really, really good hate card that also synergizes with Massacre Girl, who we'll talk about again. We'll talk about very, very shortly. She's coming up. I will have my whole spiel about her. Opposition Agent is a pretty classic, like, black card that you would find in a CEDH deck. Being able to hose one of your opponent's tutors to get something for yourself is an incredibly powerful effect. I know that there's been a decent amount of talk about, like, if this card is even still worth it. Is 3 mana too much for this effect? And for me, I think that being able to just, kind of going back to that resource denial, turn our opponents off from being able to tutor for answers for however long I need to, is really, really important. This can just straight up give you a win if it's in response to a specific type of tutor. And I think with all of that in mind, it's like, it's got to be an include in here. Spellseeker is an incredibly important card for this deck. I've had some talks with people before where they think that Spellseeker isn't worth it in the deck, or they're not very high on it, and they think that it's not a very good card. And I think that is crazy. Spellseeker is effectively a 1-card win con, or I guess a 2-card win con, with Survival of the Fittest. This can immediately, essentially survival chain up to getting Razaketh into the graveyard and getting Spellseeker in hand. When you cast Spellseeker and it resolves, ETB, you can get an instant or sorcery with CMC 2 or less, which is, in this case, Reanimate, and just gets you your Razaketh. And boom. There you go. You usually, if it's just Spellseeker and one other creature on board and then you get Razaketh out, that's pretty much all you need to win the game. All right. So the thing we've all been waiting for, Massacre Girl. So this was the new card that was spoiled in Murders at Karlov Manor. It's the new version of Massacre Girl that I have been hyping up for a while now. I made a whole video about it, which you can check out after this. I've been crazy about this card since it got spoiled. It is just kind of insane, and I'm very surprised other people aren't playing it yet or aren't seeing that value. This is just another moment of Scylla being a bit crazy about a niche card, but so the thing with Massacre Girl, as you can see, it's a 4/4 for 4 with Menace, and it gives all of our creatures Wither. So that means all of our creatures deal damage in the form of -1/-1 counters to other creatures. The other important line of text with Massacre Girl is whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. Now with these kind of ping effects, like Orcish Bowmasters, Mayhem Devil, and Niv Mizzet, this turns Massacre Girl into not just a creature control piece, but it lets us turn all of our other hate pieces into card draw engines. Basically, you can't take a game action or else you lose your board and I draw a bunch of cards. It is this kind of pseudo lock that sort of stun locks people into not wanting to play anymore. The other thing I'm going to talk about with Massacre Girl, which is also about our other 2 4-drops, is that the number 4, or at least specifically for creatures, the 4 CMC slot is incredibly important for this deck. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but Reyhan being a 3 CMC creature is huge. One of the most important sorceries in our deck is Neoform. Neoform being a 2-mana sorcery that turns our Reyhan into a air quotes better card. It's just so good. Just a Reyhan on board, and if I cast Neoform, sack Reyhan, they are going to be like, well, what 4-drop can she get? And these are the 4-drops I can get. It's Massacre Girl is the one that I go to if I already have one of these effects either on board or oncoming. Phyrexian Metamorph, which is the only clone we are running, and it's the only one I'm running because it's a 4-mana clone, and also because it could clone a creature or an artifact. So I could turn, in a theoretical line of play is turning our Reyhan into a Metamorph, which turns into the One Ring, which I think is a pretty good trade-off to have our 3 CMC commander turning into the One Ring. And the usual go-to that when, the board state's kind of early on or things aren't really getting crazy yet is Talion. Now, the last 2 creatures are our Reanimator top end. I've already mentioned Niv Mizzet. Now, Niv, normally, prior to my inclusion of the Massacre Girl package, was a Consecrated Sphinx. I actually thought that Niv Mizzet was not a very good include in this deck. It is nearly impossible to cast on its own. If you happen to draw it, you're kind of just like, this sucks. I have a 6 CMC creature that is uncastable unless I draw my dockside. And some games, it still can feel like that. But unlike Consecrated Sphinx, you are punished a lot less if your opponents either clone or take. Basically, the inclusion of Niv Mizzet is almost like a anti-punt tech, because I have been hit way too many times with opponents using clones on my Consecrated Sphinx, and it just getting hated out of the game. The card that I think Steven is on in his list currently is Nezahal, which has been working pretty well for him. It's his top-end Reanimator target and functions pretty similarly to Niv Mizzet in that it's sort of, it's like a Mystic Remora on a body, and it's this massive body that's really hard to deal with. My quarrel with Nezahal is that you can't really use it proactively. While with Niv Mizzet, it kind of goes along with the other card draw synergies in this deck, like the One Ring, which we will get into very shortly. Last, but definitely not least, is Razaketh. We mentioned him a little bit earlier. This is our, top of the top end. This is one of our main Reanimator win cons in the deck. Getting Razaketh on board and it resolving or going unanswered usually will spell the end of the game. Works insanely well with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, And that's kind of, I will get more into it when we get to Agatha Soul Cauldron. It's another avenue and another place for us to pivot around that really makes this deck extremely resilient. And the thing I'd like to highlight here is obviously the issue that always comes up with Razaketh that everyone always talks about is, oh yeah, you need enough bodies to sacrifice to get your combo pieces, and you need to have enough life, and what if they have an opposition agent, and blah 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 blah. At least to answer the opposition agent question, don't go for this line of play if your opponent is holding up mana for an oppo. That's pretty easy. Most players, before you're going for a win attempt, you should be looking at your opponent's mana. You should see what resources are available to them right now. And if it even looks like, even if one mana is open, if it's one mana that could produce a black mana and they are in black as a color, like, maybe think about holding off. One of the hardest parts about this deck is learning how to just be patient. Your windows will come where it is wide open for you, everybody's tapped out, and it feels like nothing can actually stop you. And the way I play the deck is very, very, I like to make sure that somebody else has failed a win attempt. People get a little antsy, they force something through, and it's really not the right time to force it, and they sort of throw the game, and then being ready for us to be the ones that are next in line to take it down. Now, as for not having enough creatures, we are obviously not super duper heavy on creatures. We only have 22, so sometimes it feels like, oh, is 22 enough? How are we going to make that up for that with Razaketh? We have a total of 24 creatures if you include our commanders. And a little trick that I've been using a lot is getting Orcish Bowmasters, because it makes an extra body when it comes out. So being able to 2 mana make 2 bodies for Razaketh has been really useful. We are also running Life Death. This is a classic Razaketh staple card. It's a reanimate on one end, but also a turn all of your lands into creatures on the other end. And this is the kind of line I go for if we got plenty of mana still after reanimating Razaketh or getting Razaketh out, but maybe we only have one body. Sacking that body to get Life Death and then just using our lands to go for it, perfectly fine. It's a line I've gone for plenty of times. I think it is a little risky. It's not something I would go for without protection. Those are our creatures. We're going to get into our sorceries now. We're a little heavy on sorceries too, actually, which is something I've noticed compared to other lists. 11 is a little high, but there's a reason for that, and that's mostly because each of these cards is incredibly important. We have our tutors, which are Gamble, Demonic Tutor, and Diabolic Intent, and these just get us anything that we really, really need in that moment. Reanimate is sort of the, obviously the name of this whole archetype, Reanimator. 1 CMC, return a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Such a good card. You can use it for your own creatures in the yard. You can use it if somebody else put something in the yard to try to get value off of them or to win off of them. Now, getting into our 3 creature tutors that we run in the sorcery slot, we have Finale, Neoform, and Eldritch Evolution. Finale, it is one of the great creature tutors in green. Goes right from your library right onto the battlefield. It can be a little bit expensive, but sometimes you just need that exact creature to go right into play and get you there. Another big thing to call out about Finale is that it's also kind of a reanimate. Again, a very expensive reanimate, but having the mana to get a creature back from your graveyard, that's just a mode I like to remind people of, because a lot of people forget that it can get stuff out of the graveyard. We talked about Neoform briefly already, and its uses with Reyhan, being able to turn her into any of our 4 CMC creatures. Alternatively, there is also a line of play where we can Neoform our Kraum into a Niv-Mizzet. And one of the other little things I like to point about Neoform is that Neoform gives the creature a 1/1 counter on it, which ties back to Reyhan and a lot of the synergies with Agatha Soul Cauldron. It's a little thing, but sometimes you if you're sitting there thinking, how do I get a 1/1 counter on something? Neoform could be your answer for it. The last one of these three is Eldritch Evolution. Eldritch Evolution is that one shot, like, I need this creature right now, and probably more like going for the win when you're going with Eldritch Evolution. Talked about Life Death as well. It's another reanimate effect. It's our way to fuel Razaketh, and that's kind of it. It is 3 CMC. It's considered a 3 CMC spell, so it's not tutorable off of Spellseeker, which sucks. If it was, then I think that entire line would be significantly easier to pull off. Not that it's difficult, but it would be easier. I'm going to skip Mnemonic Betrayal for now to talk about Toxic Deluge, and that is mostly because the main reason I am running Toxic Deluge, which some other decks might not. I know Steven is running Fire Covenant in his list. But the big reason I'm running Deluge is because of Massacre Girl. Being able to turn a Toxic Deluge into draw for however many creatures died is crazy. It just gives you that much more extra value on your Deluge, and that's a line of play that in a more creature heavy meta comes up kind of often. Now, these last two sorceries, Mnemonic Betrayal and Culling Ritual, are air quotes a combo together, but are also cards that I was not originally on in my Mox Masters list. I wasn't very high on Culling Ritual. A lot of people say this is the best card that green has. If you're in Golgari colors, you need to run Culling Ritual. And for a while, I didn't really get it. I didn't have any mana payoffs. I didn't have a bunch of synergies to go with. But since then, I have learned the error of my ways, especially because this card not only being an insanely powerful ritual, it synergizes very, very well with Mnemonic Betrayal. I was also not on Mnemonic Betrayal because it didn't feel like the meta I was playing in really had a lot of things to hit off of Mnemonic Betrayal. I didn't see a lot of graveyard synergies happening. I didn't really see, most of the people who were going for an Underworld Breach win weren't setting it up. They were just firing it off and getting there, and that was it. And so I wasn't very high on this card. I've changed my mind. The Mnemonic Betrayal, I think, has won me almost every single game I have resolved it. This card is busted. It is so good, especially when paired with Culling Ritual. Being able to Culling Rit, turn all of your opponent's rocks and all of the board that they've developed into mana for you, and then using that mana into Mnemonic Betrayaling and getting all of their hard work put onto your battlefield. It's crazy. This card is nuts. Very, very highly recommend running these two. So moving on to instants, we have 21 instants, which actually is probably a little low from what a lot of people are used to seeing. A lot of these kind of Grixis decks are probably on closer to 25 to 30 range of instants, and I think the main reason for that is that a lot of this section of the deck has been trimmed down to the barest best minimum here. We have to make room to have creatures in our deck, and I think in a world where maybe you aren't sold on the Massacre Girl package, that would be something that would be worth removing to make room for a couple more points of instant speed interaction, and that's totally reasonable. I think that is a totally fair trade-off, and that makes sense to me. These are just the bare minimum. I've stripped this to the cleanest, most important cards that I see in this deck and kept them here. There's no extra counter spells. There's nothing in excess, really. This is just fine-tuned interaction suite, and then a couple of important cards along with that. Starting it off, we have our free interaction suite. So it's our Deflecting Swat, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Will, Mindbreak Trap, and Pact of Negation. Those are our 5 air quotes free counterspells. They are all situationally free, but they are the most powerful interaction we have access to in the deck that doesn't require us to have too much foresight in making sure we have a certain amount of mana left open or other resources. Something you will notice is that I am not on Force of Negation. I think that Force of Negation sucks. Having a counterspell that is air quotes free in the same way that Force of Will is free, that only works on your opponent's turn and only hits non-creatures, is too limiting for me personally. I am somebody who has a lot of specific criteria for what I want my interaction to do, and that not being able to use that card to protect my own wins doesn't work for me. It feels too limited. It feels only useful if I'm kind of fallen behind or if I'm praying to draw it off of Rhystic Study, and it's just not a situation I like to be put in, and I don't like it, so I'm not running it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't run it. If it's a card that works for you, that's great. Personally, I think that the conditions that it falls under to be usable just aren't working for me. I'm just going to jump around a little bit, actually, because, those are our free counter spells. I think hitting the rest of our counter magic suite and then our removal suite is probably what we're going to do next. So we have, our Flusterstorm, our Misstep, which is also technically a free counter spell, but it's a little more situational. But Flusterstorm, Mental Misstep, Swan Song, those are our other three. So it's about a total of 8 counter spells. After counter spells, we have our removal. This is mostly all single target removal. A lot of it can hit any non-land permanent. I believe the only instant we're running that only hits creatures is Snap. And that we can see is, we have Chain of Vapor, Snap, Cyclonic Rift, and Abrupt Decay. Then next section we have is our tutors. We have Vamp Tutor, we have Mystical Tutor, we have Entomb, which gets us any card that we need right into our graveyard. We have Worldly Tutor, gets us all of our creatures. And then technically, with air quotes, we have our Forbidden Tutors, so Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact. The remaining cards that we haven't talked about yet are Dark Ritual, Brain Freeze, and Veil of Summer. So Dark Ritual is here because there are a lot of cards that are extremely castable off of 2 lands and a Dark Ritual, or off of just Dark Ritual, and it's just a burst of mana that sometimes you didn't know you need, but it's just very good for its rate. Probably would never cut Dark Ret. Veil of Summer is what I like to think of as our equivalent of a air quotes silence. It is something that you can only use proactively to protect your own win. It is not like silence in the fact that you can use it defensively to stop an opponent from trying to win on their turn or anything like that. Veil is purely I'm making sure the only thing that can stop me is Mind Break Trap. The last card I want to mention is Brain Freeze. This is part of the classic Underworld Breach combo with Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Brain Freeze. Most of the time, this is discard fodder for Ledger Shredder if I have it out, or it will just be sitting in my hand if I happen to draw it, or discarding it for hand size. We are going to talk about artifacts and enchantments together because they are the smaller sections of our deck. As you can see, we are kind of running the standard artifact package. A lot of the 0 cost rocks, so Chrome Mox, Jeweled Lotus, Lion's Eye Diamond, like we had mentioned before with the Underworld Breach, Lotus Petal, Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, and then for our 1 mana rocks, we are on Mana Vault and Soul Ring. A big thing about this deck is not being greedy. We are cool with sitting on a Lotus Petal in our hand for a few turns and not setting it up. What if they play a Mystic Remora on their turn after me? Oh, I should have played my Petal. They're not going to pay for a Remora forever. Maybe somebody is banking on an early Dockside to get them through, and you having a Petal out does it. Or a Mana Crypt that does nothing in your hand right now. There's no point in setting that up. It's all about being patient and being smart about what resources you're putting on the board and not overextending yourselves. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes you're going to get wheeled and you're going to have some rocks in your hand that you really wish you put out. But that is the thing you have to do to not get punished even harder by somebody else pushing themselves ahead with a Dockside or drawing cards off of you with Mystic Remora. And yeah, that's my whole ramble. That's the explanation for the low rock count. Now, let's get into Agatha Soul Cauldron. So this is sort of the name of the deck. You know, it's the Black Cauldron, and that is because of Agatha Soul Cauldron and Razaketh and how they interact together. This is kind of a hard card to wrap your head around sometimes, or I've seen people struggling to get its use here because they are used to seeing it in decks like Francisco decks, where it is a win con with Walking Ballista, or Obnixilis, where it is similarly a win con with Walking Ballista. My primary use for Soul Cauldron is that it is a graveyard hate piece that stops other Underworld Breach decks in their tracks. Any deck that is trying to play out of their graveyard now has something on board that they need to play around, that is instant speed and it can screw up their day. The B plan with this card is as a pseudo reanimate for a bunch of our other activated abilities that we run in the deck, our Razaketh, our Mana Dorks, our Dothi, or any of the activated abilities that our opponents have. Those are pretty much our main uses for Cauldron. The thing I stress with this deck, and the thing I like to stress when I'm playing it as well, is when I'm casting Cauldron, I will tell the table, this isn't a combo piece. I'm using this to stop the Tim Necrom player from Underworld Breaching. I'm using this to stop the Jensen Luris player from using their Hermit Druid that they have in their deck. This is purely, almost purely, a well-costed, reusable hate piece that happens to have synergy with our commanders and with some of the rest of our deck. I've heard many stories from people who've picked up the deck and have talked to me about it, asking about Cauldron and, oh, like maybe we need some more Cauldron value in the deck, or maybe I need something more in this to push it. It is a very powerful card, but it is not something that can be used like it is used in other formats where you can't really use this for value too much. Like, as you saw, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 creatures, 4 of which are like mana production that can even, you know, in our own deck that can use the effect of Cauldron. That's mostly because it's just too fragile. It's just something to keep in mind. It's a little hard to explain, I think, but you know, I just want to also say the name of the deck is not because Cauldron's a win con. It's just a movie I like that happened to have Cauldron in the name of it. And that was it. This is maybe one of my favorite cards in Magic now. After it was printed, I was so excited for it, and I'm so happy with it. And that's purely where the name of this deck came from. And that's it. It is not a win con. It's not even like a build around for this deck. It's just a cool name. That's it. The last artifact I want to talk about is the One Ring. Again, I don't think I need to get super duper in depth about the One Ring. The only thing I want to mention with the One Ring is that it synergizes very, very well with Niv Mizzet. Being able to have a draw X cards, deal X damage on a stick feels really, really good. And it's a combination that I've played against, and it's a combination I have set up, and it is oppressive, and it's very, very hard for people to win through that. Onto our enchantments. The big 3 that I shouldn't really need to talk about are Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, and Underworld Breach. Remora and Rhystic Study are our big draw engines in the deck. They are the generic, easy to cast enchantments that will just probably draw you a bunch of cards in your games. Underworld Breach, one of the best win cons in these colors. I've already mentioned it earlier, but this is also an incredibly useful card as another graveyard recursion piece, just for value. A lot of people should remember your Underworld Breach has uses that aren't just for the Underworld Breach combo. I know it feels sometimes like you have to save it for that combo, but sometimes there's a win there that you can get off of your Breach without needing LED and Brain Freeze. So just do it. The last 2 enchantments I'm going to talk about are Necromancy and Survival of the Fittest. I've talked about Survival a lot in this already. It is just an incredibly good creature tutor. It is maybe the best green card. I'm going to, people can hold me to that. I think this is the best green card, and the best reason to play green is if your deck can use Survival. It's insanely good for Reanimator strategies. I've mentioned the line already where with Survival of the Fittest and one other creature, you can activate to discard that creature, look for Razaketh, and then activate again to dump Razaketh into the graveyard and get Spellseeker, and then with Spellseeker you can get Reanimate to bring Razaketh back, and then you win the game. Alternatively, you can also... this effectively lets you turn any creature that you don't have a use for right now into a Reanimator target by following that same line of pitch, get target, pitch, get Spellseeker, get Reanimate. In the early game, if I have a very early survival and not a lot of creatures on board, I will very often use this line still to get Niv Mizzet out, because a turn 3 or turn 4 Niv Mizzet is very hard for some mid-range decks to deal with while they are still kind of getting their gears turning. Necromancy is a very new include in the deck that I haven't tested a ton of, but I had been for a while feeling like I needed another Reanimate effect. Just having Life Death and Reanimate itself didn't feel like it was enough a lot of the time, and I just kind of been itching, like I was going to try out Animate Dead, and that was like okay, and then I talked with some more players in our local meta, and I saw from their deck list that most of them run Necromancy, and that one extra mana to have the instant speed has been crazy good. Being able to hold up the mana to Necromancy back Thassa's Oracle at instant speed, or just any of our hate pieces that we need to get back to stop an opponent from trying to win. Crack your Dothy and Necromancy it back onto the board so that people can't win through that. Or Necromancing an Ewit to get your counterspell back. Any of those kind of lines. Another card I had been thinking about that would be in this card's spot instead was Manglehorn. It's a very, very different card. Obviously, it is not the same type of slot and type of effect. But for a while, I had been thinking that Manglehorn would be a really nice fit in this deck. But for now, Necromancy is where it's at. This is a flex slot. There are a couple things, as you can kind of tell, are flex slots, like the Massacre Girl package. There's a lot of flexibility with this deck to tinker it in the way that you like, and then there's a lot of things that I think are auto-includes that must be here. The last thing I want to talk about is our land package, which you probably are thinking like, oh, like, why are we going to talk about the lands? And the only thing I want to talk about a little bit is that we are not running Gemstone Caverns. Gemstone Caverns is a card that is, similar to Force of Negation, a staple that most CEDH decks run. It's, I think it's probably up there with like one of the most played lands in all CEDH decks. But it is a card that has never really impressed me. I think that the upside for Gemstone Caverns is getting you that early acceleration when you are maybe in, seat 3 or seat 4, to keep yourself ahead of the other players that went before you. In a mid-range deck like this, one that is happy to go into that mid-range grind, and if anything, is trying to force the game to go into that, I am not going to sacrifice my mulligans to have this card, and I'm also not willing to sacrifice a card in hand to have this card be functional. For some decks, that could be useful. For the decks that can use that burst of mana really early to put themselves ahead, sure. I am the type of player, and I think most people who are going to pick up this deck should be the type of player who are comfy land passing no matter what seat they're in. Land pass, land dork pass, like, just be chilling. So that's the whole deck I've been rambling a lot about, and there are a lot of other intricacies and little lines that I probably didn't go into, and there's just a lot of things that I probably haven't touched on, and would be happy to talk more about. All I do is think and talk about this deck. If you have any more questions and want to find a place to talk to me, you can find me on Twitter at @your_Priscilla. I will also include a link to the Reyhan Kraum Discord that we have that I am very active in, and that the other brewer, Steven, is also active in. We're always happy to answer questions about this deck or give people some guidance on it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. But thank you for watching. I hope this was a lot more information this time. There's a lot more information in my primer as well if there's anything I missed. So please, if you go onto this deck list, click over here on the little primer button, Please check out our other videos, and if you want to see any gameplay, our most recent episode, which is our super episode, and just watch that whole video because it's very informative about this deck, but also you can kind of just seeing it in action and seeing how I win and also how I lose with it can really inform your opinion on how to play the deck.